Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest this week is Sundance Burke. Welcome, Sundance.
Hi, Rick. Nice to be here. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Sundance is the husband of Katie Davis, whom I interviewed last week. And the two of them live out in Redmond, Washington, and quite a dynamic duo. They've both written very nice books. Sundance's is called Free Spirit, A Guide to Enlightened Being. And you guys do songs and travel around and talk to people one-on-one, I guess, over Skype and all sorts of things. And you've been doing this for quite a while. I mean, I think you said you had your awakening in what, 1982 or something like that?
Uh, I had the beginning.
Beginning of, right.
Yeah, I had the opening to a new way of being, going inside instead of going without.
Right.
Yeah.
As you know from having watched some of these interviews, and particularly the one with your wife last week, people do like to hear a mix of, the person's personal spiritual odyssey, and also, just the sort of the knowledge that they espouse. And usually that knowledge is based in their experience. Hopefully it is. If it's not, then they shouldn't be saying it, I think. So in your case, why don't you just start telling your story, and then it'll get us rolling.
My story.
Well, you know what I mean. You tell it in the book a bit. I've heard you tell it in talks. You were a lawyer. You were living in Hawaii, this and that. You ended up running into, I think, Osho's limousine driver or something. But you can fill in the details.
Yeah. You have to give me a second because, this is the one thing about the awakening is that one thing that goes away is your story. So
Yeah, I know.
I don't often tell it, but I will tell it as much
Good.
as I can.
And I'll prime the pump as much as I can to jog your memory and stuff.
I mean, yeah, basically, many years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I was trapped in the ego state of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I was a normal, quote, human being. And so I thought I was a person, and I thought I was this body, and I identified with my mind, the thoughts that ran through it, the
Yep.
thoughts that came up in consciousness. And where the story really starts in a kind of a true way is as I grew up, was the third Donald Russell Burke the third.
Mm.
And I had I idolized my father, who was a surgeon
Oh.
and a very bright man, very magnetic man.
Mm-hmm.
And I was his oldest son. And in a normal growing up, I realized that as much as I loved him, he was not a happy person. And yet, he had everything in life that life would seem to offer. And I've said this before, but he had it. He did. He was a handsome man. He had money. He had a beautiful family. He had a great career. He was very skilled. But within his own existence, he was quite miserable. And often,
How do you know he was miserable?
well, he was often abusive.
Uh-huh.
And mean-spirited.
Right.
And it usually would happen around alcohol.
Right.
Almost
Sounds familiar.
almost always around, drinking.
Yep.
Otherwise, he was a sweet, dear, kind-hearted, serving human being.
Mm-hmm.
But this became, how we study our parents, right? So this became a natural situation that my own awareness, my own consciousness bumped up against. And it was an incongruity, it was a paradox, and ultimately it was a problem in terms of establishing relationship.
So
I
as a young boy, were you actually cognizant of the paradox or the disparity between his outer life and his inner unhappiness? Were you kind of like scratching your head and saying, how could he be so unhappy if he's got his act so together? Or was it more subliminal and you kind of articulated it to yourself later on in life?
You know, I was really aware of it.
Huh.
Uh, uh, and I can only pick, let's say, when I was 16. I was aware of it before that, but um, I used to try to teach him to hug. You know, I'd put my arm around him while I was sitting on the couch and
Uh-huh.
gently say, "Now, Dad, just relax," you know.
Huh.
And I mean, that obvious.
Hmm.
And then when I was older, because this came to a head, when I was older, we'd go out together, and that would turn into a nightmare by the end of the evening after a few cocktails.
Hmm.
When I was a lawyer and he was a doctor, and we were in, you know, the, the local posh bars, trying to have a relationship, and so. As I said, that created an issue for me because, as it turns out, I wanted what most people want. I wanted, you know, love and happiness and joy and the end of all this anguish and pain and dissatisfaction. So something happened, and this is the way life is. My whole attitude toward life has changed. I now see that everything happens as opposed to I do it or someone does it. And it happened that in the midst of this dissatisfaction, on a lark, on a spontaneous moment, took a trip down to California, presumably for business, and that day changed my entire life because I met a being, a human, consciousness that I had an experience with that I'm really not going to go into the experience too much. Just say that it completely shattered my idea of reality. The experience was so profound and it was so inside me. I was at one moment electrified on a floor in San Francisco and having a vision of how my parents had run their egoic relationship through me. And I was not only seeing them, I was also seeing myself. So I was completely in another space as this consciousness.
Did you run into this guy just by accident?
Yeah.
So-called accident. You ran.
Well, I went down to see my client, and it just turned out that this particular being was staying with them temporarily at his house.
Why do you call him a being?
Uh, well, I think being is our true name for ourselves,
Uh-huh.
as opposed to person, let's say.
So
Yeah.
you use that word because this guy was established in being, and it seems superficial to refer to him as this guy, or as this person I ran into.
You know, I really don't know where. This was a long time ago, and
Yeah.
a lot of things have happened since then. A lot of growth
Mm-hmm.
has happened since then. But I can tell you that he was nothing like I was at that time.
Right.
Nothing. Other than the fact that all of us had the same true essence, and his essence was showing brightly. But again, it's hard to explain.
That's okay. So did you recognize something unusual about this being the moment you saw him, or was it more like you went home to your friend's house and you got into a conversation and then it sort of something began to shift?
Um, I was caught up in something.
Huh.
I was caught up in a whirlwind of. It's like I was thrown into another dimension and I didn't even see it coming.
Just his presence, or his just zapped you like that, and
It wasn't just him,
oh,
it was the whole environment. It was the whole experience. It
I see.
was the fact that I had picked up on a lark and
Yeah.
flown to California for no reason. I had a beard at the time and I was shaving it off
Oh, I
before.
remember that. Yeah, you told the story, and you didn't finish
Yeah.
shaving because
No,
you're late for your plane.
I got half of it off. And then I heard from my client when he picked me up at the airport that he had this master staying in his place, and I was excited for some reason, and I was also scared for some reason. And have you ever been in one of those situations where the hair on your skin is starting to stand up, and you don't know why, and it's an unknown. It's kind of it's a brand new, fresh experience. So that's really what was happening.
Yeah.
I was having this unexpected event.
Is he somebody that became
Unex-
well known, or somebody no one would have ever heard of listening to this?
A few people probably know him because he was quite infamous in his own way.
Oh.
But
What's his?
but
Do
no.
you mind telling his name, or do you feel
Well,
it's?
he doesn't go by this name anymore,
Mhm.
and he doesn't teach and hasn't for many, many, many years.
Uh huh.
And I haven't had contact with him for many, many, many years. So his name was Satoshi at the time.
Huh. No, I haven't heard of him.
This is really kind of off the point in terms of what my present teaching is, but
Yeah, we'll catch up with
just
your.
to,
Yeah.
just to lead up to it. He had a lot of cities,
Ah.
and he was very close to Rajneesh, later Osho, and both of them were similar in that they had a lot of powers, and I experienced within the first few months many of these powers, and I was 32 and he was about the same age, so we were young, fairly young, relatively speaking, and it just blew me away. I mean, telepathy, reading your mind from a distance, you go out of body for days and come back, almost instantaneous healing. He could touch you and then you have energy running out of your fingertips for hours. He used to do it to his cat every time he came in the house. Give him a little mush, 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 and the cat would and I didn't know this all at once. These things just entered, but could play any musical instrument, could go into a park and just pick up any instrument and start playing with a group.
Without ever having learned that instrument, or just he had a musical background.
I don't know. He had a musical background, but how he learned it, I don't know, because he literally could play anything.
Yeah.
And he was emotionally very solid. He didn't suffer.
Huh.
His consciousness was just completely devoid of emotional yo-yo playing. And he could put anyone in a trance just by looking at them.
Wow.
And that was my start. I mean, that isn't anywhere near where I'm at right now.
Right.
But if you really want to know how it got going, that's where it kicked off.
That's interesting. I mean, did this guy, you say he was notorious, did he ended up getting himself in trouble with all this power? Did it sort of go to his head?
Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah, he got in trouble.
Yeah.
But I won't speak for that because to him it may have been no trouble at all.
Maybe, but the scriptures kind of warn against getting carried away with this stuff because it can go to your head.
Yeah. So it's important for, I suppose, people to know that cities are really not the answer.
Right.
However, it does tell you something about the human being's potential.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things that did happen, now this is tying back into where I started this story. About 3 months after I met him and was in relationship as much as possible during that time, having experiences and learning and watching and observing, and participating, um, he told me, and we formed a close relationship pretty quick. He told me that, this is crazy, he told me that someone in my family was going to die
Mm-hmm.
soon. And he just said it straight like that. And I started looking around in my mind, like at my different family members to see like, well, is anybody sick? Is there anything, um, you know, is any, it just, so I was trying to go through some of the people in my family, like who this might be. And also I might, I thought maybe it would be me. My lifeline is really short. So it ended up to be my father
Ah,
at 58.
that's pretty young. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it was a notorious death with a. Oh, I can't go there. I can't go there. It was really shocking, and it was out of the blue,
Mm.
and you can imagine, how that got my attention.
Yeah.
Um, and then the end of this beginning story is just the fact that when I ran into this path, the path of awakening, the path of finding out who I really am, as opposed to who I thought I was, I realized that I had been waiting for this path my whole life. And in other words, I had never fallen absolutely in love with any activity or any passion. I went from one thing to the next. Might have something to do with my Dharma being an Aries, start and stop a lot of things. But nonetheless, I never could settle anywhere. And then when this path came, I knew it instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And it, shocked a lot of my family and friends, and because I just completely turned all my attention and all my passion and all my energy toward this investigation, this inquiry, this awakening, and it started there.
Did you
And
quit your law practice, or did you manage to juggle that as well?
everything fell apart. Everything, every structure I had my ego built on
Mm-hmm.
fell apart. Now it held together for a while, uh, about 5 years. I was able to keep it going, and then it was gone, and everything else was gone. Family was gone. My money was gone. My job was gone. I ended up without a car, living in downtown Seattle, doing stand-up comedy at open mic sessions.
That's funny.
And I wouldn't prepare.
Whoa.
I would just walk in. And some of those performances were okay, and others were completely humiliating.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Were any of them really great?
a few, yeah, a few. But that, again, that wasn't my... This is a part of this awakening thing, is that you at first you think the real awakening is experience-based.
Mm-hmm.
So you are seeking some sort of an experience. And you're hoping to find just the perfect experience, and you're hoping that it will be lasting. And, I found it. And so there were many, many, many attempts.
Yeah. Were you like still with this Santoshi guy, or were you kind of like visiting different teachers and trying
about,
different things and stuff?
about 3 years, I was encountering and meeting with him, and even brought him up to my home in Seattle from California, and we did some workshops, and He was a mentor. He even would do workshops and put me at his side, so that I could not participate but watch. Um, I'd have to say that he was the really only teacher that I really had in that kind of a formal relationship way. He also introduced me to Shunyata in California, who got his name from Ramana Maharshi in India. And when I met Shunyata, he was 91,
Wow.
and he was labeled by, that's not the right word, labeled, but he was given the grace and blessing of Ramana by, by a personal encounter in front of Ramana where the telepathic words, "We are always aware, Shunyata," came to this being. And he was one of the first people that Satoshi introduced me to when I went to California. It was actually in Marin. And he just said, "You want to go meet a friend of mine?" And he didn't tell me anything about him. He just took me to his room. He was being hosted by a local family. And I walked in, and there's this 91-year-old mystic, and quite honestly, they say that a mystic means the wholeness of the cosmos. And so it was actually kind of difficult to tell whether he was a man or a woman. But just being in his presence and seeing him actually blew some more of my programs. See, this is the whole thing. All my conditioning was being destroyed and busted. And just being in the room with Shunyata and Satoshi, and they would talk, and I would say nothing because I was actually stunned. And I actually couldn't stay in the room for more than about 10 or 15 minutes in the beginning. It was just too intense, and nothing was directed at me. It was just energetic, and so that destroyed my concept of old age. He floated around the room. He wore red high-top Converse tennis shoes, and Indian garb and the turban, and another dimension. There were miracles happening all the time, crazy things right in front of my eyes, and I just
Overt ones, or more again on the mental level of telepathy and that kind of thing?
overt. I saw him trip on the carpet, like he was gonna, and to me, he looked like a falling man.
Yeah.
And then this leg comes out and stabilizes him. Just one, almost like some sort of a yogic thing or something. And then a lot of it was just funny. One time we were in the room with him, and his room was really dusty. He had papers and books everywhere. He was very cerebral, very intelligent, very conscious. And somebody asked him about the accumulation of dust in his room. And his response to that was, "I don't bother it. It don't bother me."
That's great.
Now you can learn a lot from that,
Sure.
Yeah. So it was just one thing after another. I felt very blessed, and I also felt scared and excited, and I was really being put through a course. These are the old days. A lot of this stuff doesn't even happen anymore. I mean, it was very, very energetic.
You'd be surprised. People get in touch with me all the time saying, that they just woke up one morning and all of a sudden their kundalini was rising and they didn't know what was going on, and they started like thought they were going crazy, and just really starting to cook and looking for answers, and there's all kinds of people. I mean, you'd say it yourself in your book and elsewhere that there seems to be this global awakening taking place, and the popcorn is popping all over the place. So, in a way, what you were experiencing was maybe, I mean, certainly people have for thousands and thousands of years have been in the presence of people whose very presence was enlightening and transformative, but it's a bit, I suppose, of a relatively new thing in the West, and maybe in that regard you were something of a pioneer. These days it actually is happening practically on every street corner, it seems.
Yeah, which is nice.
Yeah, great.
Beautiful, yeah. In fact, it's really happening in a big way now.
Were you doing any kind of like spiritual practices or disciplines during this time, or basically just living your life and things were popping?
I was given again, here we are, you're still at the beginning, but I was given, and this is fine, I was given a lot of spiritual texts to read.
Okay.
I knew nothing about it in any real way. No formal practices, never really actually have ever had a teacher that recommended a complex mental practice. Almost everything that I was exposed to was communicating, be aware. The only two words I ever got from Shunyata in terms of a teaching, and I went to him one time in a terrible emotional state where my ego was just under huge attack, and I was resisting, and I was in a lot of pain. And I went up to him, imploring for help. And he just looked at me very calmly and casually and said two words. He said, "Go within." And he didn't say it with any great compassion that I perceived either. It was just like, this is direct advice, go within. And I took that to heart. What does that mean, go within? So, that became my contemplation. And I would say that is the main teaching, that it's our attention normally is directed as a person to the world, and to the self, the objects, the object me, the object world, the object you. And this was, turn around and investigate within yourself. And we know how to do that actually very naturally. We're habituated to avoid it in the old consciousness, but there is a consciousness now that is arising very strongly, that is actually we're getting to know the consciousness itself, something that we actually never even took credence of. So we're looking at what is your beloved, the one that will not betray you. What does not change about you? What is always true? And so
when you say we, I think you're inferring we as a culture, because obviously there have been individuals throughout history who've been adepts in this domain, but there seems to be something new about the proliferation of it, the commonality of it, the fact that people everywhere are getting familiar with the kind of thing you've just been saying. It's not so unusual anymore, right? I mean, that's what you mean when you say we, because in a sense there's nothing new under the sun, but in terms of it being more widespread.
I think I'm talking to those that are making the transition or about to. I'm talking to us who are awakening.
The kind of people who would be inclined to listen to this thing.
There's always been,
in the first place.
There's always been awake being in existence, for sure. And But we're living out this drama, this story that is, we're living right now in the most amazing time. It's just, it's incredible. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, so 5 years in, you were doing comedy in nightclubs, and your life was falling apart. So, but you say that's still the beginning. We really haven't gotten to the more significant thing you wanted to say.
Well, I mean, that is the story part, I mean,
Okay.
and there's many, 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 many more stories.
Sure, many stories and experiences, and
Yeah, but the point, I mean, the point is that once we turn within, once we turn to discover who we are, hopefully that is something that can be completed. That you can actually, well, I guess they call it self-realize now. You can actually allow the ego to fall away.
Yeah.
The false self, and to stabilize.
Right.
And to find out in a very congruent and centered way, who are you? Who am I? To the point where you don't need to ask that question anymore.
Right.
But I mean, the long and the short of it is that I worked very, very, very hard for 17 years, which, is just a relative term. Some people are less and some more and some never. It doesn't make any difference. But for those who say there's no effort required or nothing to do, I would say no. I did hundreds of different things and spent endless hours. But I did get focused on, and I didn't go to many distracted ways of learning, at least from my point of view, and that's all it is, my point of view. I liked the simple teachings. I was in love with Nisargadatta's work, his expressions. I got that book very early, and I wore it out. I still have it, and it just falls apart in my hand. I read it so many times.
Need to get a new copy.
I just loved him, and
Yeah.
because he had a lot to say, and it was all incredibly intelligent, and in essence, it's all very simple. I mean, his main teaching, and I agree, I help people in this way too, is just be aware of your base, the only thing you know for sure, and that is I am. It's a true fact. I am. You can say that. It cannot be disputed. And you get to know that. You contemplate it. You feel it. You go beneath those two words. And you stay with that as your meditation. And you can, doesn't matter what you're doing. You can be at work. You can be eating. You can be right here talking. I now see that this is the one thing that the human, and this is a story too, our human story, this is the one thing that we never gave cognizance to. In other words, we're very interested in the body, the physical form, and very interested in our mind and emotions and in our senses. But the power that allows all of that to exist was never even spoken of. Like you go to school.
Yeah, they don't tell you
Yeah.
this stuff.
No, they say pay attention, but they tell you what to pay attention to.
Right.
But they don't actually tell you to pay attention to attention, or to see what that power is. So in effect, we have all these people operating in this, again, story world or dream world who have no idea who they really are. And then they're making assessments about everything they see around them and saying that I know this, I know that, I know this, I know that. And they're skipping the self.
Yeah.
I don't know myself, but I know everything else.
And most of them don't know that they don't know who they are.
Right.
You know,
No.
most people haven't even asked the question yet, or it hasn't even dawned on them that they might be something more than they take themselves to be. I
Right.
mean, this I am thing you just said, I mean, if you say that to most people, they're going to say, well, you know, I am Rick, and I like to, you know, eat such and such, and I play the guitar, and I work at this job, and I, you know, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Right.
Which, of course, has nothing to do with what you're pointing at.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. I mean, those are things that you learn, and you can't tell anybody this. They have to look for themselves. They have to really investigate for themselves, find it directly. That, my goodness, um, that image of myself that I see, or that I think, or that I feel is not really who I am.
Right.
You know, and so with our intellect, we can actually see the things that are false. But that's as far as really the intellect can take you. We can see the false. We can see the false. We can start letting things drop away. We can start to see the programming and the conditioning, and then and we start to and by observation, by looking, you learn. And that's how everybody learns. That's how we've learned anything really.
Yeah.
Is through paying attention.
So were you kind of doing this during that 17 years, reading books, and then just sort of continuing to
Constant.
yeah, it
Constant.
became probably second nature to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It was constant. And so, as an example, there's a really good reason not to have a formal practice, because formal practices are limiting. Usually you have to have the right environment, you have to have the right amount of time, you have to, you know, set it up in a certain way. Usually they've got big structures. But if you have just the practice of turning within, and the practice of being aware that I am, in other words, I'm standing in a line in the grocery store, and in the old day, I'm aware right now that I am.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you'd be surprised, just check it out for yourself. Most people are not even aware that they exist.
Hmm.
And this is what is establishing presence. We call it presence in the Western world. Or presence means I am aware that I am. And you don't really need to do anything. You don't need to go anywhere beyond that. You don't need to add anything to that. You don't need to take anything away. Just really actually experiencing what that's like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it reveals it to you on its own. The value of it, the truth of it, what it is.
Yeah. In defense of formal practices, which I've been doing for 44 years, though, I would say that the things aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
You know, you can do a practice,
Right.
but you can also be doing what you just said, and they can actually be complementary.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no. I was not making a rule.
Right.
You know.
And some people actually do well to have a discipline of some sort that they kind of, I mean, anything can be taken out of proportion or become obsessive or whatever, but I know in my own case, my life was such a shambles when I first learned to meditate at the age of 18. I'd dropped out of high school and been arrested a couple of times, and, you know, things were crazy, that it was tremendously, you know, nourishing and healing and profoundly. It turned my life around on a dime, you know. So
Yeah. Beautiful.
so my tendency is to never sort of say, well, you don't need this, you don't need that. It's just say, if it works for you, more power to you, you know. And also maybe you could also say, consider this, because this is also good. So keep your eyes open, keep all your options open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, that's the problem with a personal story, is it's too limiting.
Yeah.
You know, that's why we're here together.
Mm-hmm.
So between us, we can broaden the picture.
Yeah, and we'll do
and
that.
go beyond the person, because it's you're right. This is really all about each being going within their own self, and then they determine.
Yeah.
What
I think as long as personal stories are told in a way that doesn't make people conclude that their story has to be like your story or something in order for any XYZ to happen. It can be interesting. You read autobiography of a yogi. You don't need to be like Yogananda. It's an interesting story. you know?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
and some people do. I do get feedback from people who say, "I love to see the variety of ways in which the circumstances in which people woke up. Not that the circumstances themselves were responsible for it, but it kind of gives people hope sometimes. That even they, ordinary Joe Schmo, doing this, that, and the other thing, that you don't have to be a special person for this sort of thing to happen."
Yeah, it's true, but as long as it doesn't distract you
Yeah.
from your own. Um, and I have actually seen where it does distract. So,
I have too, and I've seen
yeah,
people try to emulate others and eat what they eat and dress
yeah,
like they dress and talk
right,
like they talk, and
right,
your point is very well taken if that's what a person ends up doing.
yeah.
There's going to be a run on these like blue sweatshirts after this interview.
I doubt that.
Uh,
Yeah.
okay, so where were we? I shouldn't ask you that. I should.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, you talked about the 17 years and how there was this sort of intense, earnest focus, reading and looking at yourself. Self reflection, self referral, and the number 17 seems to be significant because it implies that at the end of 17 years there was some kind of breakthrough.
There was a breakthrough. During that period, I never was a teacher. During that period, I never shared. Um, I always had, even though I would have unbelievably profound, and toward the latter part of that time, I thought I was free. I
Uh-huh.
thought I was liberated.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking the last 2 or 3 years. I was completely different from the beginning, and I thought I was liberated.
Mm.
And um, then in one retreat I went to with Eli and Gangaji,
Uh-huh.
so I'll give them a kudo here.
All right.
Uh, all of a sudden, I was with Katie. All of a sudden, we were in Hawaii. All of a sudden, I had this enormous longing come up,
Hmm.
and I hadn't experienced that for years. And actually, I felt my life was quite clear, and that's only my feeling to me. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, this enormous longing came up, and I was on fire with it, intense.
Did it have a target or a focus, or was it just an abstract longing?
It was like I felt bound,
Mm.
and it was, at that point, I just you don't. Hopefully, you don't deny, what your experience is, and whatever I was thinking, I was like, it was had nothing, no power over what I was actually feeling in that moment,
Hmm.
and again, like I said, I'd never been a teacher, never shared, so there was something in me, right? There was some doubt, or and this is hindsight helping a little bit with the conversation, but I was burning on fire to express truth, liberation, or whatever. And I went up to the, how it is when you go to those events. I went up to the front row, and I was going to get the microphone, and I was going to, and I was going to speak, and I was going to get Gangaji's attention. And she had spoken to my heart a few years earlier. I didn't go to many of her events. I never. Well, anyway, that's a sidelight. But I'm very intense, and the funny thing is, I don't think Gangaji even knows this story,
Mhm.
because I've spoken with her later, and this is just something that happened within me, and I started to try to say some things to her, and I was saying stuff going through my mind, and it was like, I want to die. Words were trying to come out, and they were kind of like heavy words, and I don't know, something happened. I just stopped. I just the whole thing just collapsed. And I, s- I s- I sat there for a second, just kind of stunned. And, and I just put the microphone down in my lap. And and again, the only funny thing that Gangaji did do is after that happened, she sat there kind of stunned herself and she said, "Oh, thank God, there is stopping." And there was nothing magical about that event other than what I just told you. But it just turns out that I actually realized, and it took me many, many months to realize that something had shifted from that moment forward. And it was, I had stopped making trips to the mind
Hmm.
to find myself, to identify
Interesting.
myself.
Interesting. So for many years, this, self-reflection, self-inquiry thing was almost like a practice you had been doing, had gotten into the habit of doing, perhaps even unconsciously. It had become so second nature. And then at that moment, that habit just sort of evaporated, and henceforth you didn't do it, but you didn't even realize it until later on that you had stopped doing it. Sometimes when I ask a question, I just restate what the person says in order to make sure I clearly understand what they did say. But that's it, right? I mean, that's what happened.
Yes, that's pretty much it. I mean, I actually had, the way I discovered it had stopped is a singer, a spiritual singer friend of ours came up to our house and was
Hmm.
going to do an event
Was that
with us.
Kirtana, or I think her name
Yeah,
was?
yeah,
Yeah,
it was Kirtana.
yeah.
And she asked me if I had longing, and I said no.
Hmm.
And it was only at that moment when I answered that question, and she was surprised, like, you're kidding. And because that's really part of her songs too. And I'm not saying anything about her because I really can't, but I'm telling the story.
Hmm.
And I didn't have longing anymore.
Hmm.
And I just realized it then, and it had been that way ever since Hawaii. And so there was a shift there.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's interesting how sometimes the shift will take place and it won't even be recognized at that moment. It is only recognized much later on in retrospect. You kind of like think, whoa, that was really a turning point, and I didn't even realize it at the time.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
uh,
and along with that, and I think this is good for everyone to check out on their own, but I realized that, um, on some level, I was seeking an experience. And I think along with the end of longing was also the end of doubt, the end of questions, the end of seeking, and because the real realization was, oh my gosh, it's not an experience,
mm.
you know?
Would it be possible to give us a little bit clearer understanding of what you mean by longing, what longing was, and what it wasn't once it had stopped?
Ooh, that's your heart wanting to just totally break open.
Hmm.
Um, that's like this awakening allows your joy to come out, your love to come out, your smiles to come out, your connection with nature, your innocence, your purity, and that, whether we know it or not, we all long for that. And when we can get really, really honest with that longing, we allow it. And so most people are holding it down. And there's a lot of belief systems that cause us to hold it down. I mean, we think it's scary and it's not good for love hurts.
Yeah.
And there's many, many messages, much conditioning that is holding down this desire to awaken authentically to who you really are.
So wouldn't you say that most spiritual seekers are consciously longing? That's what defines a spiritual seeker, as this sort of conscious realization that there's something more than what they're living, and they're longing to kind of find it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I think it's longing is very, um, what's the right word?
natural.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, some people say, well, stop seeking and all that. If that's, cart before the horse. I mean, if the finding hasn't happened to a sufficient degree, then the seeking is natural, and you're just going to be driven.
Yeah. And I
If
think
somebody
it's
said to you, stop seeking the week after you first met that Santoshi guy, and you were just a newbie on all this, it would have been completely inappropriate, right?
totally, yeah.
Yeah.
From my point of view, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you had to. I don't know if we could say had, but you obviously went through 17 years of processing, and I don't know if that could have been shortcutted.
Yeah. Well, I don't see anything wrong with seeking, and I
Me
don't see
neither.
anything wrong with not seeking. I mean,
Yeah.
whatever the moment, whatever is truthful in the moment. And here's another point. There's a few good points. Earnestness, like really wanting
Hmm.
to be free, wanting to be enlightened, wanting to be self-realized, wanting to know who you are, really being earnest about that. That's good. That helps.
Yeah.
And then being honest as much as possible with yourself. Um, that also plays a big role. Being able to see yourself, to witness honestly what's going on, so that you're not, because we often, and I, believe me, 17 years is a long time. I mean, I went on many dead ends and didn't tell myself the truth all the time.
Mm.
But it does pay to be as honest as you can possibly be.
Hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I think this stop seeking thing is often attributed to Papaji, and I interviewed Neelam a few weeks ago, who studied with Papaji quite a bit, and she said that the context in which that was said was really, in his presence there in Lucknow with all these people, and, and he was kind of saying, hey, just relax. I mean, it's right here before your eyes, and
Right.
it's here in abundance. Just sort of chill and settle into it, and you know
And I think that not seeking is often totally appropriate in satsang.
hmm
I really do think that that is almost the best thing you can say in satsang is rest.
yeah. I was up on stage making a fool of myself one time with in the presence of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and I don't know, I was a very intense guy, and he came out with this beautiful thing. He said every day is life. He said, don't pass up the present for some glorious future. Just sort of, and he went on a little bit, but that was the essence of it. And I think it took me down a few notches, and I kind of realized that, sure, the future may be more glorious in a sense than what one is living right now, because life has an evolutionary tendency to it. But if you pass over the present I'm going to be miserable until I am such and such, then you're putting yourself out of balance, and out of tune with the flow.
Yeah. Well, the presence is absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the most radiant and richest experience of being is to be present. And our life, when it's present, is going to change a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Because many teachers have talked about the seeking aspect, moving away from this moment, moving to the future. It's the next moment. It's not this one. No, it's right here.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also the easiest and most sane way to live, because then you're not dealing with an imagination,
Mm-hmm.
either coming from the past or projecting to the future. You're not dealing with imagination. You're dealing with a very simple experience of right now. And you realize that that's so easy to be with. and it's not complex.
Right.
See, you don't even need to get into a real complex mental state or, do all these mental gymnastics.
Hmm.
It's all right here, and it's beautiful.
When you were talking about your experience at the Gangaji and Eli retreat, and prior to getting up on the mic, you said you this longing came up and you felt, I think you used the word trapped or constrained or bound or something. Um, was it sort of a sudden dawning of awareness that you weren't as free as you thought you had been? That because you mentioned you thought you were liberated, but then this longing came up and you realized you hadn't been liberated. Was there sort of a sense of, being bottled up or dammed up? And because then you mentioned when that sort of relaxed or burst like a dam, then there was this outpouring, kind of greater freedom of expression of love and happiness and all that.
Well, I'm not sure I would describe it the way you were just putting it, but it was because it wasn't a contemplated situation. It was super present.
Yeah.
In other words, the presence was incredibly present.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the longing was incredibly present.
Uh-huh.
So it was like I'm in a fire. I'm in it. And I didn't even know what it was about. It's beyond contemplation. It's I didn't know what it was.
But it just came up
I
spontaneously.
just knew that I had to deal with it.
Yeah.
I had to face it, and I had to come to terms with it. But I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know what those terms were, and what happened I did not expect, and that's just it's a mystery, I guess.
It kind of sounds like though you did face it and come to terms with it right on the spot. In other words, like it bubbled up because it was time to face it, and then there with Gangaji, it sort of, worked itself out.
Yeah, and I think that's the value of satsang,
Mm-hmm.
of being in satsang, is that it's the perfect place for that kind of encounter with yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people so-called people have taken, that opportunity to heart.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you say you were with Katie at that point?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you guys had already gotten together. Yeah. Okay.
We've been together since 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And Katie was also an enormous part of my awakening. And it's just our heart connection. I'm sure we met by grace. There's no other explanation. And the rapport and the natural intimacy, and I was in awakening and she had awakened, and these two awakenings come together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a story I won't tell you.
Well, you don't have to. But one thing about it is I kind of got, that's neat. I kind of got the impression from her book that when she met you, you were already awakened or something. I met this wonderful awakened guy, but you're saying that she was instrumental in your awakening. So I guess maybe what you're saying is that it was in process, and then she was another big engine on the train, which...
No, there was no distinction between us. So that it's impossible to put us on a scale of relativity.
Yeah.
When that comes together, there is no scale, and the terms awakened or self-realized, that doesn't make any sense at all to the relationship at all. You're basically in service to the heart in something like that, and everything is bowing to the heart. And so I would say that was more the path of devotion that was in our world. And it was a very, very, very natural devotion. There was no agenda, no, it was just so obvious.
Mm. Some teachers say that only after self-realization does the path of devotion really does it become possible for the path of devotion to really be profound, and because it has a foundation, you see, of knowing who you are as opposed to being completely oblivious to who you are, and so there can be a real flowering of the heart. Would you agree based on your experience?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, devotion isn't something I can describe with any truth.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's really all I can really say about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Words are just too crude and superficial to do it justice.
I don't know if I really want to make any statement about it. Honestly, it's kind of sacred.
Okay.
Um,
Well, that's good. No, that's I understand. Yeah. It yeah. It sort of trivializes it in a way to try to bring it out verbally and discuss it. I think I understand.
it's so not an object.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, I read about a third of your book. I didn't get a chance to read the whole thing. There's always a lot going on around here, but I really enjoy what I read. You have the book, the whole structure and flow of the book, I'm sure, much clearer in your mind than it is in mine. Are there some kind of highlights as you think about the book that would be interesting to discuss and perhaps interest people in reading it to find out more?
Well, why don't you tell me what you picked up from it? Because honestly, I don't read the book very often.
Well, you wrote it.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, it's one of these books that it's kind of nice to read in small doses. I found because there's a lot packed into different each sentence and paragraph, and I don't know how many chapters I got through, but it's just each time as I was reading, I was kind of wishing you were there to kind of say, hey, let's talk about this, because
Yeah.
a lot of different points were interesting. But let me bounce it back to you. If you had to summarize the book in a short paragraph, what would you say it's about?
Hmm. It's about the two main paths to freedom that are on the wisdom path, the
Mm-hmm.
path of jnana, and that is basically self-inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So the chapter on self-inquiry, I think, is very important. It's very powerful. And the other is presence. Learning that you are presence and using that presence to deal with all the dilemmas of getting over your programming and conditioning, which are based in time, the illusion of time, the psychological time of the false self. So only by presence, only by the witnessing consciousness, can you really, be free.
So you're saying that self-inquiry and presence are actually two distinct paths, and one might take one or the other and perhaps arrive at the same goal. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they are distinct. I mean, doing self-inquiry does have a structure.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I used it often, and it's in the book, and it's laid out in many places by Ramana. And what better question is there to ask yourself than who am I?
Yeah.
I mean, if you had any question to ask yourself, I think that would be the best one. And there is a structure to it. I mean, you want to find out what the source of that I is, where that I is arising from,
Hmm.
what that I is. And it can be a very practical technique that you can take anywhere. It's not hard. It's like you can use it on the simplest things, like whenever you, let's say you get irritated or something from service at a restaurant, and you just might ask yourself, who? Who is irritated?
Mm.
I am. Who is I? It's so incredibly powerful that it completely can disengage you from the egoic path and the misery and suffering related to that in such a simple way, as can presence.
Hmm.
Just
So let's say,
basically,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh no,
Well, let's say you're in that restaurant. Let's say two people are in the restaurant, and they're both getting irritated, and one guy, uses the self-inquiry technique. Who am I? Who is getting irritated? And so presumably that diffuses the irritation, because it sort of breaks the fixation on outer directedness and I'm mad at the waitress and so on and so forth to sort of a inner directedness and kind of a location of the source of the irritation and deeper than that. And the other guy, let's say, uses presence or witnessing. I think you equate the two. Um, Elaborate on how that would work for him in that situation, as opposed to self-inquiry, just to distinguish the two things that you've laid out.
well, presence is really understanding that you're consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of being a name or a form or an object, you're actually the moment of space. You're the entire field. You're a field of now, a field of presence. You're an emptiness. So if you're truly present, if you are truly present, nothing going on in that field will bother you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not truly present, if something is bothering you in that field, then if you just turn to presence, turn to consciousness, pure consciousness, then you will, realize the truth. You will be liberated. You'll be free. Otherwise, you'll be bound by the resistance you're having to that moment being as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are identifying with the content. You're identifying with the play of forms and experiences in front of you in your field. And it's always that identification from whatever technique you're using with the limited self, which is literally a false self, because it will betray you constantly because it never lasts. It's totally impermanent. So anytime we are identifying who we are with the changeful, with the impermanence, we will suffer the duality involved in concepts. So,
It sounds like the outcome is the same. In fact, I'm still not totally clear on the distinction between self-inquiry and presence, because it seems like self-inquiry, as you've described it, sort of gets you to that state of presence.
well, if they both lead to the same place, then you could actually say there is no difference.
Right, right.
I mean, here again, the mind plays tricks on us.
Mm-hmm.
It wants to distinguish things, but really everything is indistinguishable.
Right, all roads lead to Rome.
But we do talk, and by our talking, we can make that distinction,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be heard for others. That it's so easy. We have this old habit, this mental habit. It's very ancient, and it's very established. And so anytime we can catch ourselves, because there's like a tempting force trying to pull you back into
Identification.
trying to pull you back into the idea that a concept is real. A concept is real. A concept is real. Here's a real concept. You know, it's no, they're not. You know, even I am. Um, you can boil that down to a very base concept. But actually, what it's really showing you is that you're beyond. You're beyond the concept. You know, there is. This is where the mind is really freed, because when the mind is no longer identifying, then it's free to serve the truth. And that's a great release.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that's the crux of it, because you still need concepts in order to function. You couldn't do anything if we didn't have concepts. We'd just be a lying on the floor in a daze or something. You know,
Yeah.
you need concepts to go shopping. You need concepts to drive your car. You need concepts to have a conversation, and so on. But it's, you know, the extent to which you are identified or locked in. Uh,
Yeah,
to,
it's the enmeshment that is the
yeah,
problem.
yeah. That's the
Because
problem.
why don't we just look at concepts as a tool?
Hmm.
You know, they're in our toolbox.
Yeah.
And I bring out a tool and I use it and I put it back in the toolbox when I'm done with it.
Hmm.
And that's I think really where concepts lie. They're with material form, they're with names and places, they're with diversity, but they have nothing to do with who you are,
Right.
and absolutely nothing to do with who you are.
And in that vein, could you even say that the ego is a tool, which, you know, you use as you use your intellect, your senses, your mind, your, you know, your physical apparatus, but it has nothing to do with who you are. It's just it's usually in the driver's seat, but, you know, if things are properly sort of realized, then it just has a sort of more of a subservient role, and isn't seen to be really running the show. It's a tool.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't agree with just the way you phrased that,
Okay.
because I don't see the ego having any reality. The ego is false.
Hmm.
So it's just false.
Well, is everything false then? All the other things I just itemized, or just the ego is false, and then, but the mind, the intellect, all those things have some sort of functionality,
Well,
some sort of.
now we're getting into semantics, because now we have to figure out what false means.
Well, people seem to pick on the ego. In other words, and yet, you know, everyone seems to even.
Well, you'll have to tell me first what the ego is. I don't know what you mean by ego.
I would mean by it some I sense, and, you know, some sense of, you know, where somebody comes in the room and says, "Hey, Sundance," and you turn your head, you know, because there's some sense of localization, and yet, you know, for as we started out talking an hour ago, for most people on the planet, that's the kind of entirety of their existence. You know, that's me. That's what I am. But, you know, for someone who has sort of realized the deeper dimension to life, it's peripheral. It's kind of floating on the surface, but it doesn't completely get eradicated. At least that's my experience. But my experience may be, you know, immature. Maybe at some point, my experience will be quite the opposite. I don't know.
Wow, I'd rather than have a discussion about the term ego,
Hmm.
I'd rather frame it in the sense of uh, suffering.
Okay.
You know, however we couch these things, or whatever their terms are, if you're suffering, and this is really our own investigation, then whatever is going on, that process is false.
Right.
And um, when I use the term ego, I'm really referring to misidentification.
Hmm.
And that misidentification causes suffering.
Yeah.
So absent that, I really don't care about the word ego very much. I mean, to me, it doesn't have anything to do with this body,
Hmm.
you know, whatever you want to call this body, or the world itself, or the fact that you know, you can move about the world, you can do everything with the physical body, everything with your emotions, everything with thinking without thinking.
Hmm.
You know, there doesn't really have to be a image self there. Like I look in the mirror in the morning and then I carry that image around with me all day long. That to me is the ego. I'm constantly thinking about myself in the past. I'm thinking about myself in the future, what I'm going to do next, how I'm going to handle the next event. So the ego is that which takes you out of presence. It's that which confuses you or veils your realization of who you are.
Okay. Well, I can understand. If you define ego that way, then I can understand why you would say that it's just it's unreal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I tend to use it more in the sense that there's even a person who is not in the least bit identified or trapped or bound or overshadowed can still there's still a kind of a kernel of I sense, which it is not exclusively their sense of I. I mean, there's a much broader, vaster reality to what they know themselves to be, but there's still sort of a functioning, utilitarian component to the personality structure that is never utterly eradicated, and it seems that if it were, then it would be difficult to function.
You wouldn't have any world at all. I mean,
yeah, right.
In my own experience,
Mm-hmm.
As long as there is consciousness, there is an I sense.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, it's that simple. I mean, I have actually seen consciousness arise,
Mm-hmm.
come out of nothing. And before the world started, before my body started, before anything started, I saw there's an identity there, but it's nothing. But there's a definite sense of being.
Yeah.
But there's nothing. And then light, and then body. This could be like waking up in the morning. It can happen waking up in the morning. So consciousness brings in the I am. Actually, and I can't speak about this, but I believe that really we are something beyond consciousness, because I've seen consciousness arise and I've seen it set. So who has seen that? But there's no sense of I am in that. There's no sense of self.
Right.
So consciousness and self, pure consciousness, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I, but really, is the I the body, or is the I, at some point, the I becomes consciousness, pure consciousness. That's who you know yourself to be in the manifest world.
Right.
In that which is manifesting, I am consciousness. So it's very beautiful, actually, to live as that truth, because that big self is quite miraculous and a lot of fun. And you're clearly not the doer. I am consciousness is not the doer. See, the doer is the body, the person. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna get this handled. No. Give it to consciousness. Let go of the struggle, of that personal struggle. The personal fears, everything personal, because that's not truly who you are. It's not truly who I am. And it's a graceful life.
Yeah, that's good. That's very well put. It's a matter of kind of proportion and perspective. Are you the ocean or are you the iceberg? Well, they're both water. The iceberg just happens to be a little bit more precipitated, and it floats around in a specific place. But the ocean is everywhere, and maybe all the icebergs are all essentially the same as the ocean. But they each have some individual expression, but ultimately they're all ocean.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are. We're everything in this world is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I am consciousness. You are consciousness. Everything is consciousness, and I took that very pragmatically. And it's amazing to me that sometimes it doesn't seem to be able to be seen. But this is very pragmatic. When you wake up in the morning, because we're already having this discussion, you'll probably understand what I'm pointing at.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you? I mean, does does just your body wake up? Does just your thoughts wake up? No. Everything wakes up.
Hmm.
It's all there. It's all there. I mean, it's everything around you is there. And it's like, why don't we allow ourselves to be our totality? We're told some story, some other story, you know, but that's not actually our experience. Our experience is that the totality of manifest life is present as us. And but of course we have been told a false story, and it's just to contemplate and investigate what is the truth. Look within, be honest, take a good look, and we discover truths when we look,
Mm-hmm.
and we see for ourselves.
I don't know if it's just a matter of what we've been told. You know, it's not like one generation deludes the next, and and so on and so on, generation after generation. It's more like the mechanics of human experience are such that the outer directed attention results in kind of a focusing down to the point value and a loss of the universal value, and it becomes habitual, it becomes conditioned, and we get locked into it to the point that we can't just turn around and appreciate the universal value. And like yourself, there was a process over many years of reversing that conditioning that had become ingrained. Would you agree with that? That's more of a statement than a question, but it almost sounds like when we say we've been told, it's like there was this sort of diabolical plot to delude us in our infancy, and we perpetuate that through the generations.
Uh, yeah, well, it's just a story. I mean, I could say that the ego's a diabolical plot, but ultimately, and this is honest, Rick, I just I don't like splitting hairs to try to
Mm-hmm.
find truth. And it's hard for me to do that and come up with anything that makes any sense to me. In a lot of ways, the most powerful teaching that Katie and I do, and we don't do it, but it happens, is just sitting in silence
Mm-hmm.
as consciousness. And so really, because that's where everything is really going.
Right.
It's going to silence. It's going to stillness. It's going to the mountain.
Yeah.
And the field. And so a lot of times things can be said so many artful ways, but they always seem to be moving the opposite direction that really I see the truth in. I see the truth moving to stillness and silence and pure awareness, and not really having so much to say about what it's like or what it is or how this thing differs from that thing. And, it makes for interesting talk, but it doesn't really speak truly,
I think
in my opinion.
you're rebelling against your years as a lawyer.
No,
Well,
no.
well, just to play devil's advocate to that, I think there's truth in what you say. I mean, people can get really caught up in intellectual gymnastics about all this stuff without any kind of correlation in genuine experience. On the other hand, there have been some great teachers throughout history who engaged in vigorous debates, like Shankara, for instance. He would go around India debating all these people, fully established in the experience that he was discussing with them. But it was, that was just his tendency, his proclivity, his capability, and it was in keeping with the culture. So I'm not a scholar. I'm not an intellectual person, but I don't have too many advanced degrees or anything like that. But I'm just sort of making the point that I don't think that intellectual discrimination and discussion is necessarily incompatible with presence and being and realization. It's sometimes painted with that brush, but it's largely a matter of sort of individual tendencies, and for some people it's completely inappropriate. But it's one of those things, like you said earlier, about formal practices. Different strokes for different folks, to each his own. For some people it may work and be appropriate. For others it's like nonsense, not interested in it. And I kind of respect all the different tendencies that people have. I mean, you go to this Science and Non-Duality conference in San Rafael, and you hear some brilliant minds really kind of discussing this kind of stuff in great detail. And others, they're very simple. They get up there and maybe start having tears running down their cheeks or something. They're just not. In fact, Francis Lucille, when he got up to speak, he just sat there for 20 minutes. And at the end, he said, it's not so much what we say, it's how much we love that matters. And he got up out of his chair and left.
Yeah, beautiful.
So.
Thank you.
But if everyone who came to the conference did that, I think nobody would show up again next year. So different strokes for different folks. Sly and the Family Stone.
We fit beautifully together, all of us.
Yeah. Many flowers in the garden, and it would be, it wouldn't be a very pretty garden if all the flowers are exactly the same.
Yeah.
One point I wanted to kind of come back to a little bit was your discussion of witnessing, because you kind of established that as a significant part of the book, and I had gotten that far in the book. Are you suggesting that witnessing is a here we go again with intellectual nitpicking, but are you suggesting that witnessing is something one actually does or practices consciously and intentionally, or is it more like a symptom of a certain state of being where naturally one finds oneself the witness of all that goes on?
Well, the way I was taught it, and I actually feel the way it was realized as well, is it didn't start with witnessing, it started with self-observation.
Okay.
And I actually learned about that teaching that came from, at least the source I got it from, was Gurdjieff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then instead of calling it witnessing, he called it self-remembering. So
yeah.
From self-observation to self-remembering.
Mm-hmm.
Very early on, I took up contemplating that teaching.
Uh-huh.
So in the beginning, it might start as self-observation. So you're basically, you think you're a person, and you're just starting to observe yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good. And it bears fruit, and spontaneously it might deepen at some moment where you, instead of a person observing yourself, that you slip into a consciousness and presence. You just slip into it. And see, there's so many words for the same thing.
Sure, yeah.
The point of the word witness really is the non-involvement.
Right.
With experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not taking sides. You don't particularly have a point of view, except what they would call a neutral point of view. Sometimes I call it the harmonizing force. And it's a little controversial nowadays to use the pyramid, but in duality in the mind, you've got the base, and the polarized forces, active, passive, moving back and forth, yin and yang. And then at the top of the pyramid, you have this eagle, this overview.
Uh-huh.
So the witness is not taking sides with either side of the support structure. It is just viewing impartially what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than, in this witnessing power, rather than being trapped in the forces of duality, which are opposing and contradicting each other, and also working together, but basically they create the dualities of life, pleasure and pain, desire and fear, stuff like that. The witnessing allows you, it's called the harmonizing force, the peace force. You can imagine that if you're trying to create peace and you have two warring entities, that this mediator, if he's willing to hear both sides and to consider both sides as legitimate, and because he has no resistance or bias to either one, he's actually taking in the true story, the true picture. So each of those parties are feeling met, then there might be a equanimity and a balance that results from that consciousness that's involved in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And if we call some period of humanity's experience the Dark Ages, where these lower forces were in constant duality and conflict with each other, and the spiritual energy of the witness had not entered into the scene, then the possibilities for harmony and balance and peace in a real way might not have been realized. And so I think what's happening in the world now is that this spiritual force, this harmonizing force, this third force beyond the forces of duality, has entered the scene, and to the extent that we access it, it's bringing that to our own experience, not only on the inside but also reflected on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible to sort of be in tune with this harmonizing force, or to be sort of in this witness consciousness, and yet at the same time take a stand? Because, like, for instance, in your book, your commentaries about the way our country behaved after 9/11, as contrasted with how we might ideally have behaved, to me kind of implied a sort of a progressive liberal perspective, which I share, and and yet is it possible to sort of have a kind of a conviction like that, and yet at the same time be on a deeper level perhaps be impartial, universal in one's perspective?
I believe so. I mean, I believe we're at that point right now,
Mm-hmm.
where as many of us as possible, as many parts of consciousness as possible, can get together and be present,
Mm-hmm.
and not be coming from the polarized forces of desire and fear, warring with each other.
Right.
I think that we could have an influence, and that we can make appropriate decisions. I won't say what any specific decision would be,
Right.
but certainly not reacting to a negative situation with more negativity. I mean, some of these things are just common sense. They're not high spiritual principles. It's obviously the public is being completely manipulated to a very ignorant point of view, and is under the sway of a very dangerous beliefs. And hopefully we are, if that goes too far, obviously it gets very, very bad, which is what's happening now. And then out of that suffering, we finally have had enough, and we are looking for a new way. And that, many times in the past, that new way was not really a new way. It was just a change. In other words, I overthrow you and throw in some more despots, and the whole thing turns into a mess about 20 years later. But now it's really, really, really serious, because there's a lot. And again, this is kind of a metaphorical story of what happens on the inside with all of us waking up. The two go together. It's all one.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I believe that people will be looking to presence for the next decisions that are made in this world. I hope that is the case. It is real. It is present, and that's what your show is about. And there's many, many others in the world right now. It's very active
Mm-hmm.
as we sit here.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, and you made an interesting point there, which is that the sort of there's a lot of change now on the outside. People waking up, people not kind of passively accepting stuff that is really unacceptable by any decent standards, and that the correlation to that is this sort of kind of epidemic of spiritual awakening that seems to be taking place. I think the two are very much intertwined,
Yes.
and it's we're all playing different roles. Some of us more political and activist, and some of us more quiet, perhaps. But again, different flowers in the garden. We all have our individual roles to play. But it's heartening. It's kind of gives one hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it definitely is happening. We're bringing light. Light is being brought into the situation. So really what's happening is that the false is being exposed collectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are enormous falsehoods. There is an enormous disillusionment going on collectively, worldwide.
Yeah.
And that disillusionment collectively is changing the whole paradigm of what their beliefs were. They thought the world was operating a certain way. And when you actually do find out what the real depth of it is, what the real story is, it is just totally, completely nothing like what we've assumed.
Yeah.
And this is even true for me. In the last couple of years, as the collective story has been revealed to this consciousness, it's like, are you kidding me? I mean, I knew things were wrong. I knew that the world was, definitely insane. but actually, what the real story is just so mind-blowingly different than we've been told. That when people wake up to it, it's going to shake us all collectively, but it's also going to shake our insides, because even your inner story will no longer make sense. Once the outer story is completely destroyed, it'll shake you all through your foundations, inside and out. And so I think at that point, I hope that it's a turning to the heart. It's a turning to love, and it's seen from the witness point of view that we are one being, one consciousness. And I have often said that there will be one job in the future, and I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime, but it just might. It just might. And that would be service.
Mm-hmm.
Service to others. Only one job. And it doesn't matter, you'll be doing all kinds of different things, but the attitude,
the spirit, yeah,
and the understanding, or as Shunyata used to say, the inner standing, will be totally, here in the heart.
Yeah. Like you might be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a bus driver or whatever, but it's where you're doing it from that.
Everything will change, though. There'll be plenty of money. There'll be plenty of abundance. There'll be no poverty. None of that stuff will exist. It's only existed because of the lack of spiritual energy, the lack of the witnessing force.
Yeah.
It's only come about in inattention, no presence. See, things are sneaking up on us and using us, and we gave our power away. But, you can reclaim your power by being who you really are,
Mm.
being the witness, being present. Because really, what can happen to you when you're present?
Right.
Who can sneak up on you and make you do something silly, or say something silly, or hurt someone, or go
Mm.
off here. You're present. Here, go off to war. Go fight this war.
Right.
You know. I mean, hopefully we have enough of a charge and a presence here that this may be this a beautiful beginning.
Mm. I'm glad you got onto this topic. It's you get really animated when you begin talking on this theme, and I appreciate it. It's good. I was on a boat ride one time with Maharishi, and people were talking about this, what he called the phase transition. This is like 1975. This huge change that he saw coming, and many people were even then talking about it. And then people said, "Well, how can we survive it? It sounds like it could be really cataclysmic." And he said, "Well, hang on to yourself. Hold on to yourself. That's all you need to do."
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's so true now.
yeah.
Those are very important words. Be your truth.
Hmm.
Be super. Let it bring you into, as Eckhart used to say, bring you into intense presence
Mm.
when the going gets very dicey.
Yeah.
And then you know how it is when disaster happens, how people come together naturally.
Yeah, like earthquakes or
Yeah, yeah. No,
tornadoes or whatever.
unbelievable,
Yeah.
unbelievable how much our hearts open up, how much our eyesight opens up.
Yeah.
Oh,
Even a snowstorm, here in Iowa, you have a
yeah,
big
yeah,
snowstorm. Everybody's out helping shovel each other's driveways and,
yeah,
feeling all this neighborliness. These people you haven't talked to since
yeah,
last winter.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's important. I'm hopeful that we're going to get to the um, well, there's two cruxes to the problem. One is inner, and the other one's outer.
Hmm.
Uh, in a sense, they're both the same, and it is the ego, the ego inside, and then the ego outside. And we need to get to that ego, and we need to say, your time is over. This is completely false. I'm done with you.
Mm.
I have realized who I am now, and you no longer have any power over my life. In fact, I recognize you. I am looking at you. I'm watching you.
Yeah.
It's like Anonymous.
Right.
Except we forgive. Because there's nothing to forgive once you realize. Everything's fine.
Yeah. It's great. I remember back in the 60s or early 70s when all the kind of protests and riots and whatnot were taking place on the college campuses, and I was in college, and I was already meditating at that point, and I thought I felt like, okay, well, I'm making my contribution. I feel like these guys are just getting too carried away without referring back to the foundation, without the sort of, there's too much ego involved, not enough self-referral. And nowadays I look back and I think, well, if it weren't for their efforts, the Vietnam War might have lasted a lot longer than it had. And, so people need to do stuff on the outer level as well. They can't just sit around and meditate and expect the world to change. I think that there's a kind of a balance, and perhaps those who have been a little bit primarily inward oriented could actually benefit from being a little bit more engaged outwardly, and vice versa. The Occupy people and all have to remain, or have to remember that there's a deeper dimension to this that's really motivating this awakening, and stay true to that in order to stay on track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's all one. It's one big, huge manifestation,
Mm-hmm.
and no part in that manifestation is unimportant.
Right.
It's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Separation is a notion that has no existence in reality. So whether we know it or not, we are all rowing the ship together.
Yeah, yeah,
And I just honestly think we are living at an amazing time where we are going to see a paradigm shift um, globally, and very, very different than the past, like the French Revolution or the American
yeah.
Revolution,
Right.
where basically the same forces remained.
Mm.
A new force is entering here, and it is this consciousness. It is this witnessing. It is the awareness of a higher truth that is already present, does not need to be established. It's just waiting to be felt and to be seen and to be lived and to be realized.
Yeah.
And it's happening, and that's what it's been growing and growing and growing and growing, and we always wondered if it was going to grow fast enough
Yeah.
before the manifestation decided to take a turn for the worse. But yeah, I don't know if I would say hopeful for me as much as I would say I'm kind of excited and kind of enthused by it.
Yeah, me
And
too.
and I because I don't see any uh, real disaster, not from the point of view of who you really are.
Right.
There's nothing under threat,
Hmm.
but how do we live here? How do we enjoy this time? How do we spend this now together? You know, I'd like to be with you, and I'd like to be with people like you, and I'd like to, and I have compassion for when I see them suffering, even when you're loving them, and the more the love grows, the more they're surrounded by it. We can have a really, really sweet life, I hope.
Yeah, it's very inspiring to hear
I
you
did
say it.
say,
Actually, at one point I got goosebumps when you were saying that. It's like it kind of ramped up my inspiration level uh, for this whole thing.
yeah,
So, um, it's beautiful. I'd actually like to recommend a book in addition to your book. There's a friend of mine named Robert Cox who about 20 years ago wrote this book called The Pillar of Celestial Fire and the Lost Science of the Ancient Seers. And in it he talked about, and what you were saying reminded me of it, he talked about subtle energy and how, it's this sort of subtle force which causes spiritual evolution and which kind of enlivens the physiology and so on. And he actually he goes into great detail, but he said that there's this sort of precession of the equinoxes which happens on a cycle of 26,000 years, and we're approaching the point at which a huge sort of influx of subtle energy will come kind of awash bombarding the earth from the sort of center of the galaxy, and that's why we're experiencing this quickening in consciousness around the world. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on that, but the book came to mind, and I think a lot of listeners might enjoy it.
nice.
Yeah, Robert
Thank you.
Cox is the guy's name. So anyway, we probably should wrap it up. We've been almost 2 hours. Is there anything? There are probably a million beautiful little nuggets in your book that we could go off on discussions about, talk for another 2 hours, but out of mercy for our listeners, we can conclude. But is there anything that has kind of been in the back of your mind that you feel like we ought to have touched on that we haven't?
Hmm. Well, just because you were mentioning the book, the only thing I'll say about Free Spirit and also Katie's book, Awake Joy, is that they were written in presence,
Yes.
in presence. So more than the ideas that are in them, the real value in those books is that they contain that energy of presence and help uh, everyone resonate with it, because that's just what the book is. It has that frequency in it. So beyond the actual directions and statements and words, there is a flow, and I think that's the real value of the book. And I think that's the real value of any true spiritual teaching, is not what they say, but to be the realization that you're trying to communicate, so that it's not a trying to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
It is an actual offering. And
I got that feeling
yeah,
while reading your books. Both of them, they kind of
yeah,
settle you down, you know, because of the energy that the level from which they were written.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Thank you.
actually was on a spiritual retreat a couple weeks ago with Sharon Landreth and had Katie's book with me and got quite a lot of reading time in on the retreat. So that was a nice combination. Kind of came back here and hit the ground running again. So I didn't have quite as much time to read your book, but it's very enjoyable what I've read of it so far.
Thank you. Thank
How'd you
you.
get the name Sundance?
Uh, I don't know. I mean, it came from a cat.
Oh.
You have cats.
I have a cat. Right.
Katie and I. Yeah.
She often sits in my lap while I'm doing these interviews.
What's her name?
Leela,
Oh, nice.
which means play in Sanskrit.
Yeah, yeah. I know the word.
And then we have a couple of dogs too.
Yeah, I just I don't know how I got it actually. I mean, I had a cat that we two cats that we picked up at Lake Quinault. They were wild and they were living at a lodge and they needed a home. And their names were Sundance and Moonbeam. And when we brought them home with us, Sundance in a day or two was gone, either eaten by something or just took off.
So you took his name.
Go figure, you know.
That's great. When I was a kid, there were two cats living across the street named Sunbeam and Moonbeam. Very close.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway, it's a nice name. So thank you, Sundance. This has been enjoyable, and I really hope I'll run into you one of these days. Give you a
Okay.
big hug. I'm sure
Can
we
I-
will.
Can I give a little schedule, very small?
Yes, please, go ahead.
'Cause we're going to be somewhere near you.
And keep in mind that people might be watching this 2 years from now, 10 years from now. So let's give a date and time
So-
and day.
So let's go to our website. If you want to see our schedule, is my website is www.sundanceburke.org. That's B-U-R-K-E. And our schedule is posted there, Katie and my schedule. And in general, in June we're going to be in North Carolina and
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C., and then back to North Carolina for the wonderful gathering.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And we've decided to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing with me and being present with me. And I enjoyed it very much.
Me too. We'll do it again sometime.
Okay.
So let me make a couple of concluding remarks. You've been watching an interview which is part of an ongoing series called Buddha at the Gas Pump. And all of these interviews can be found archived at batgap.com, B-A-T-G-A-P, which is an acronym for Buddha at the Gas Pump. And if you'd like to be notified every time a new one is made available, you can subscribe to the little email notification thing there, or you can subscribe on YouTube, and YouTube will tell you when new ones come up. Although I'm having a little problem with YouTube at the moment. Won't go into that. There's also an audio podcast that you can subscribe to with Apple's iTunes, and there's a link to that from the website. There's also a fairly lively discussion group, two discussion groups actually, one on batgap.com that crops up around every interview. And then there's also a Yahoo group called Buddha at the Gas Pump, which is a little bit lesser known, but there's some pretty good discussions there. Sometime you'll find a link to that on batgap.com also. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sundance.
Bye-bye, Rick.
Bye-bye. And thank you to those who've been listening or watching, and we will see you next time.